Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government whether it plans to appeal the decision of the Court of Session that the UK Government acted lawfully when enacting a Section 35 order in relation to the Gender Recognition Reform Scotland Bill.
Cabinet Secretary Shirley-Anne Somerville.
We note the judgment and will consider its terms. Devolution is fundamentally flawed if the UK Government is able to override the democratic wishes of the Scottish Parliament and veto our laws at the stroke of a pen. The Scottish Parliament passed this bill with a large majority, including members of all parties.
Meghan Gallacher.
It's not really an answer on the timeframe, though, is it, Cabinet Secretary? SNP ministers were warned on multiple occasions that their gender self-ID bill threatens the protection for women and girls in Scotland. However, the SNP ignored our warnings. The scandal of the double rapist Isla Bryson proved that predatory men will try to exploit self-identification to gain access to vulnerable women's spaces. But the SNP ploughed on regardless and took the UK Government to court to get this bill enacted. So does the Cabinet Secretary think that the £230,000 wasted on this court challenge was money well spent?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, until ministers make a decision on the appeal, these are still live legal proceedings, and it does restrict what I can say on the matter. But with reference to some of the examples that the member gives, can I point out that that is under the current Gender Recognition Act as passed by Westminster and appropriate right the way through the United Kingdom. But on the matter of the issues that were debated at Parliament, can I point out that at no point did the UK Government suggest or threaten or even approach the subject of a Section 35 being ordered as this bill went through Parliament. It was subject to 2 consultations in public and a very, very large amount of parliamentary scrutiny. So while the Government is disappointed with the judgment, we will take time to reflect on that and will come back with our decision on the appeal in due course.
Meghan Gallacher.
Answer on the timeframe, no answer on the amount of money that this bill has already cost the taxpayer. Opinion poll after opinion poll has shown that the SNP's gender bill remains unpopular, with each of its provisions, such as letting 16-year-olds change their legal gender, being opposed by a large majority of the public. So when it comes to wasting further taxpayers' money with a potential court appeal, will the Cabinet Secretary be listening to the public and ditch this bill for good? Or will she be in favour of her Green Coalition partners who want to spend endless amounts of public money getting this flawed bill enacted instead?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I'm sure Meghan Gallacher must be aware that the costs are already in the public domain because I answered a parliamentary question on it. So we're certainly not hiding anything on the costs to date. And the reason why this was an important legal challenge, and it wasn't a decision that we took lightly. We considered it very carefully. But there is an emerging pattern of interference in devolved matters by the UK Government. They routinely now ignore constitutional convention that the UK Parliament will not legislate for devolved issues without the consent of the Scottish Parliament. In 2021, the UK Government, of course, referred the UN CRC Incorporation Bill to the Supreme Court. They have now ignored legislative consent decisions of this Parliament on several occasions, such as the European Union Withdrawal Act, the UK Internal Market Act, the Professional Qualifications Act and the Subsidy Control Act. There are also several instances in which the UK Government has refused to acknowledge the Scottish Parliament's view that legislative consent is required, such as the Nationality and Borders Act. As we have seen with the breaches of the Seoul Convention, once this sort of intervention has happened, the UK Government will find it easier to justify using this power again and further erode devolution.
Thank you.
And
Cabinet Secretary, I need to go to the next question.
The next
supplementary question. The supplementary will be from Karen Adam.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I agree with the Cabinet Secretary that the Court of Session ruling was a demonstration of the fundamental flaws of devolution. Of equal note, last Friday will have been disappointing and traumatic for many. Will the Scottish Government give an unequivocal commitment to continue to do all that it can to support the community? And what assurances can the Cabinet Secretary give today that any decision in relation to the ruling will be treated with the utmost sensitivity.
Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. So the Section 35 order does raise very serious questions about devolution, as I've said in my previous answers. But we do, of course, acknowledge the specific impact on the trans community in Scotland. Yesterday, I had a series of calls with LGBTQI and women's organisations, and I heard about the disappointment and dismay in the trans community. So I want to be very clear that no matter what happens with this legal challenge, the Scottish Government remains committed to the LGBTQI equality. That's why we're taking forward legislation on ending conversion practices in Scotland, why we've published our non-binary action plan, and why we're taking forward steps to improve access to NHS gender identity services.
Supplementary, Paul O'Kane.
I'm very grateful, Deputy Presiding Officer, when the Cabinet Secretary made a statement to Parliament in April outlining the intent to take this legal action. I asked her about those wider supports for trans people in the intervening period, because a vacuum is created in any legal process. And she said at that time that although the Government viewed the bill as important, it was not the only area they are working on to support the trans community in Scotland. So can she update the Chamber further in terms of what is being done to support trans people right now, and in any further intervening period before the Government takes a decision?
Cabinet Secretary.
Can I thank Paul O'Kane for that question? And he did quite rightly raise the wider and varied concerns of the trans community when we discussed this item in the Chamber previously. I mentioned some of those aspects in my answer to Karen Adam around the non-binary action plan, which was a very important piece of work that's been undertaken by my colleague Emma Roddick. And we are absolutely committed to taking forward that end of conversion practices bill before the end of the year. We're very keen to make sure we're moving forward on this, and particularly around aspects around health services, where I know there are a number of concerns in the trans community. We have started to see improvements there, but there is absolutely still much more work to do.
Supplementary, Ash Regan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The court judgment has vindicated the concerns of women's rights campaigners that the Gender Reform Bill would negatively impact on the operation of the Equality Act and therefore on the protections for women and girls. Now that the Government has been forced to face the folly of their position, will they take this timely opportunity to apologise to women's rights campaigners for dismissing their concerns as not valid?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, clearly, all the way through the passage of the two consultations and of the bill, there were meetings with a varied number of groups, those who supported the bill, those who supported the bills but suggested changes, and those who were vehemently opposed to it. But what I would point out to the member is that the judgment actually, although it was based on the gender recognition, is around the aspects around the Section 35 order, which, quite frankly, draws a corch and horses through the devolutionary process. And that's something I'm disappointed that the member is not more concerned about.
And supplementary, Jamie Green.
Thank you. 86 MSPs from across the political spectrum supported the underlying aims and principles of the bill. Just as equally, there are many who undoubtedly would not support any form of change to gender reform in legislation. But given that many of us who did support those principles did so under firm reassurances from ministers that the legal advice they had sought was sound, can I ask if it would now seem prudent for the Government to make some of that legal advice public, if nothing else, to demonstrate that it acted in good faith with Parliament?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, clearly, neither the Scottish Government or UK Government routinely publish their legal advice. So this isn't something that's a special significance to the Scottish Government, but also exactly the same process that the UK Government would hold to, as we've discussed the Section 35 order. But what I would say to Jamie Green is he's quite right to point out that there were differing views as this passed through, but it did pass through Parliament. This is a bill that passed through with the consent of the large majority of MSPs, including people from all parties, and it's disappointing that the voice of the Scottish Parliament has been vetoed at this nature.